Okay, everyone. We've got our second speaker ready to go for Nova Code Camp on the Cloud Track channel. I'm super excited to have Sidney Andrews on. Sidney is a Azure MVP and he's a Microsoft certified training regional lead. He delivers some amazing content in Azure. I've actually watched and taken a lot of his courses personally, so I can say that he does some amazing content. So I'm super excited to hear his talk on the Microsoft Auth library for .NET. And yeah, without further ado, why don't you take it away, Sydney? And so why don't you, I'm going to stop sharing my content and why don't you go ahead and share your content?
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Labrina. Everybody, super excited to talk to you today. I'm gonna share my wonderful desktop. I say that, but you might see it and disagree. Um, I don't know how I'm gonna live up to that intro, but I'm gonna try my best today. I'm enthused because I've been going around talking to people about MSI.net and for a while now, and more so than anything I've ever talked about, it's just excitement. And it's because developing an off space has always been so traditionally difficult. So I'm excited to show you that it's way easier now and show you how it's done. And then we are going to be very demo heavy. So at first I used to do this talk and I would never show any slides and then I realized that was super confusing. So a couple slides up front and then tons of demos. That's what we're going to do today. So Sidney Andrews, like Labrina said, I'm an Azure MVP. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. Training is my lifeblood. It's what keeps the lights on. They're purple right now, but it keeps them on. Um, this talk like I said, I've been given a lot. I'm working with Microsoft US developer, and we have put together a YouTube channel. We have videos into much deeper topics on this. If you go through this session and you come up with a question, msusdev at Microsoft.com is their alias. I'm listening on the other end along with a couple people from Microsoft, and we've gotten some super amazing, sometimes crazy questions that have stumped me, that the product team jumps in and is like, yeah, here's a edge case feature for 15 years ago, and that's how you fix that. I'm like, how am I supposed to know that? So msusdev at Microsoft.com. If you see anything in this presentation, or you go home after, or well, you're already home, but if you go to the other side of your office later on and decide to implement some of this code and run into challenges, not just me, but it's a group of us that's trying to help people out and get them developing off apps. This presentation I'm only showing you 5 or 6 slides. We actually have a full deck and presentation we give at conferences and stuff on GitHub, github.com/msusdev. If you don't want to type in the rest of it, you can just go there and look for Microsoft Identity Platform Dev. That's my intro. Let's actually get into the meat and potatoes here. 2 goals today, 45 minutes to try and do this. I'm going to show you what the Microsoft Identity Platform is and show you how you can authenticate manually to the platform. Once I've done that, I will show you the MSAL, or Microsoft Authentication Library. Yeah, an acronym, a 4-letter acronym for 3 words. So confusing. But the MSAL library, I'll show you how to use it and how it makes that left-hand side much easier. I always like to show the left-hand side first because a lot of people use the MSAL library and then they're going like, oh, this is so easy, and run into a bug and can never troubleshoot it because they have no idea what's going on underneath the hood. So I always believe in, let's look underneath the hood and then let's move to the smart car, right? So I always like to preface with identity as a control plane. I like to always start here. It's something that when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. But if you've never seen this slide before, you're like, what in the world is he talking about? Basically, you use a lot of stuff, and even more so now during COVID. So you're using work applications, you're using third-party applications, you're using applications from Microsoft. You're logging into devices, whether it's that laptop or desktop in your office, your mobile device that checks the Outlook app. If you're working in, or if you're supporting or working in a factory scenario or farm scenario, IoT devices, sensors, data collection devices, even concepts you don't always think of, like our connections to other business, our connections to each other, whether those are team messages, whether those are emails, whether those are applications where we collaborate with maybe vendors that we work with, or even our own clients. All of these are connected by one common concept, and that's identity. At the end of the day, if you log into an app, if you log into a device, if you email somebody, at the end of the day, you're sending it to typically an email address. Now, this is an interesting concept because that means if we can master developing against identity, that means we could connect a whole bunch of different components of our organization without having to write a lot of manual connectivity code. We can lean on our identity platform. And many of us, not all of us, but many of us have this in some way already. See, Azure Active Directory is an identity service, and it's at the core of a lot of these connections. So when you log in to your laptop using your work identity, you're connected to Azure AD. If you're using Office 365 or Office Desktop, I know Office Desktop is coming back. Wow. You're using those, and you're logging into your Office apps, or you're logging into the browser-based apps. If you're logging to third-party apps, maybe your company has a corporate box.com subscription. Even your own apps you build yourself, Azure Active Directory becomes that control plane. So, long time ago, developers got together and said, we need a library to develop against that. And they came up with a very rough early library, the Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL. It was the 1.0, and as you all know, it's kind of like tech, right? You always use the second version. Like Apple Watch 1 users like me, we got burned once we saw the Apple Watch 2. Same thing with ADAL. ADAL was rough. I remember the Hello World example of logging in and getting your profile information, and ADAL was like 60 to 70 lines of code. I wasn't going to do that because not only do I have to memorize all of that or copy and paste it, I don't know what each individual piece was doing. So it was unnecessarily complex. It was also limited. ADAL really only worked with Azure AD accounts. See, when I say that, I really talk about native accounts. So that means username at your organization's domain. But Azure AD is capable of much more than that. Notice I said Azure AD is an identity service. See, Azure AD is focused on allowing you to use whatever identities you need to use for the solution. So yes, you can use native identities in Azure AD, your corporate or your organizational credentials. You can use organizational credentials for other people's companies. So let's say you bring in a consultant. Their organization already has Azure AD. You can go ahead and just reuse their identity instead of creating a brand new account for them. I can't tell you as a consultant myself how many times I've had to explain to a client, no, you don't have to create an email for me. You can just add me as a guest to your tenant. You can also add in third-party accounts. Again, Azure AD is an identity service. It supports many of the common and popular authentication protocols, such as OAuth. So Facebook identities, Twitter identities. You're like, oh, I work in a big corporate organization. We don't care about Facebook, Twitter, and Google identities. Do you care about GitHub identities, LinkedIn identities? Or maybe your HR people would love to connect to LinkedIn to pull profile data, obviously with the user's permission. Maybe your developers would love to connect GitHub in a serious way to your organization. So this whole idea of developing against identities is way bigger than just the small set of corporate credentials you have for one for every employee. So Microsoft needed to create a library and a platform that was more comprehensive, and that became the Microsoft Identity Platform, or V2. The Microsoft Identity Platform powers pretty much most of the identity stuff you do. You go to Microsoft.com, log into, let's say, Microsoft Learn or Docs.com. You go to the Azure portal. These are all powered by the Microsoft Identity Platform. Now, the old Azure AD version 1 endpoint still exists. ADAL is still out there. If you want it, go have fun. I'm not going to stop you. But the Microsoft Identity Platform is definitely the way to go moving forward because it still gives you the ability to connect to your organizational accounts. It allows you to connect to people's personal Microsoft accounts. It allows you to connect to other organizations' accounts. So if you want to bring in a guest from another tenant, and it allows you to connect to social local accounts. And the great thing about this platform is that you don't change the way you develop. You change your configuration if you want to add in additional accounts or change the different tenants rather than changing your whole development flow like you have to do with ADAL. That is the end of my presentation. I'm going to show you the play space we have today. 3 things we're going to use today. We have Visual Studio Code. loaded with just two extensions, C# and the REST client. This is just a super popular REST client, just to show you what it does, because I don't want you, no tricks in this presentation. Test.http. Create a test.http file. I'm going to issue a GET request to HTTPS, http bin.org, and their GET endpoint. Send that request. HTTP bin. Bin has a B in it. I said it out loud. I have a case of the Saturdays. There we go. It issued a GET request. See, these are the only things we're using. C# extension, so we get good IntelliSense, and this HTTP request extension, so we can learn the endpoint. So if you remember to that first slide, we're going to use this REST client extension extensively to authenticate manually, and we're going to use the C# extension extensively to use the msi.net library. Two other tools we're going to use today. We are going to use Windows Terminal because I just like the command line. I'm crazy. And then we're going to use the browser because, well, browsers are fun. All right, so I have a fictional user. That person's name, if I go to portal.office.com, is Elton Dixon from ConnectEco. So edixon@connecte.co. This is the hard part. I have to remember if I know his password. Now, when I go to log in as Elton Dixon, I'm going to see, that's the only thing I don't like about Edge. It doesn't zoom in the address bar. If I want to zoom in, that means I can't see anything, not just the browser page. So if we go in, let's look at this URL. It's super interesting. See, it goes to login.microsoftonline.com. Then it has a word in there, common. I'm going to come back to that and what that means. I'm going to put these on separate lines to make them a little bit easier to see. If you can't see any of the text that's out there, just go ahead, post something in the Q&A, let me know. I'm more than happy to share that out with you. The next thing we see is it goes to OAuth 2 endpoint. Okay, interesting. And then from there, it goes to the authorize endpoint. And it passes a whole bunch of query strings. And this gives me this page. So what does this page mean? Well, this page essentially is a landing page for the organization. So let's back up. Remember I was here, Microsoft gave me a white screen. Because at this point in time, Microsoft doesn't know who I am or where I'm logging in or which organization I belong to. Because remember, the only URL I put in a browser is portal.office.com. Now, once I select Elton, it says Elton is part of the ConnectEco Corporation. So it takes me to ConnectEco's branded login page, which is their tenant. This works in a lot of different ways. Let me do that. Let me see if I can get it to work. So I'm going to jinx myself. This is what happens when you demo live. I'm going to try and log in my personal email address. It takes me to my organization's login page. I use passwordless login. If you ask me what my password is, or you're going to, I don't know, if you say, Sidney, what is your password? Or we are going to detonate the bomb. I'm like, well, you know, it was a good run for me. So going back, I'm going to log in as Elton Dixon, connecte.co. Not .com, Sidney. All right, PA55W.RD. Somebody asks, hey, that V2 endpoint, that's pretty much like the OpenID Connect, the whole protocol and workflow. Yeah, you pretty much got it. All right, so I'm logged in as Elton. Here's going to be my fictional user for the day. It looks really sharp in that suit. I wish I looked nearly that sharp. All right, so from here, I have a goal in mind. I want to log in as Elton and connect to some service. Now, for today's demos, and because we only have 45 minutes, I can log in as Elton and I'm going to connect to the Microsoft Graph. So the quickest way to get to Microsoft Graph is aka.ms/ge, or Graph Explorer. I'm going to put that, I made an announcement in the Q&A, aka.ms/ge for the Graph Explorer. Now, from here, I can connect to the graph, and if you've never heard of the graph before, I could spend whole 30 minutes talking about the graph, and Daryl Miller, who actually came down to DC to do a whole talk on API management, will be very proud of me. But I'm going to give you the 30-second intro. The Microsoft Graph is basically a HTTP, pretty RESTful API for all of Microsoft 365. It connects to everything. Do you want to get your emails? Do you want to create a Teams call? Do you want to join a group? Do you want to upload a file to OneDrive? You use the graph. You can even manage Azure AD with it. So graph is just super, super interesting because as a developer, you just told me I got an API for everything. Yeah, that's the graph. Now, you can see why I'm excited. Somebody says zoom in just a little bit more. I zoomed in on once. Is that looks like we're gonna make sure you zoom in. Thank you so much. I always ask the people, let me know to zoom in. So to get to this, I have to go to graph.microsoft.com version 1.0/me to get my profile. I'm gonna run that query, and there's Elton Dixon's profile. So let's copy that. I'm gonna go to Visual Studio Code, and you remember we have that HTTP client. So I'm gonna go graph.http is the name of the file. I'm going to issue a GET request because that's what the Graph Explorer told me to do. I'm going to issue that GET request to graph.microsoft.com/1.0me. Let's send the request. I need to authenticate. So this is where we're going to walk through authenticating manually. Now, when we authenticate manually, we can use different flows. And that's the kind of slide I almost accidentally showed you too early. We can interactively authenticate where we send the user to the browser and then we grab a token immediately and go to the graph. We can do authentication flow, code flow where we send the user to authenticate, we get a code, and then our service, as many times as it needs, goes to the Azure AD backend on its own in an independent fashion and gets tokens or refresh tokens so it can keep accessing the API. So user logins once and our server keeps using the token. There's device code flow where we just give the user a code and the user goes to log in by themselves on another device, and then we give them the token. That's super useful if you're doing like IoT or mobile development. Lots of different flows we can do. Today, we're going to try the authentication code flow in this demo, and then we'll do the interactive flow later. So how do we do the authentication code flow? Well, for the authentication code flow, I'm going to just say auth.http, we need to issue a request. So we're going to issue a request to https login.microsoftonline.com. Now you might say, Sidney, where did you get that URL from? Well, the URLs on how to do different authentications are available on docs.microsoft.com. Matter of fact, I just put an announcement in the Q&A with a hyperlink to a tutorial that's going to show you the manual authentication I'm getting ready to do. So once we have login.microsoftonline.com, again, same rules apply. If you can't read this text, tell me to zoom in. I love zooming in. All right, login.microsoftonline.com. Now from here, I need to tell it which organization I want to log in the context of. Now, you noticed earlier we saw common. Well, common means any identity, whether it's like a Microsoft account, a social account, or even an organizational account. There's other keywords. We can do consumers. Consumers mean a Microsoft account. When would I care about Microsoft account? Maybe you're building an app that integrates with Xbox. Well, nobody's really going to log into Xbox with the organizational account. So you might want to just scope it to personal or Microsoft accounts. What if you're building a corp-to-corp application? Nobody will ever log into it with a personal account. Then we'll use the keyword organizations. If you have your own organization, you can even put the GUID for your tenant in here. Fun fact, if you put the GUID for your tenant in here, it's actually going to influence the login page because it can make some assumptions about if you have a GUID in there, it knows exactly which organization you're logging into. So you see the branding much earlier in the process. Now, we're going to log in using organizations, but before we move on, I'm going to go to the Azure portal. See, anytime we want to work with the Microsoft Identity Platform, we need to create what's called an application registration. So I'm in the Azure portal. Edge, please remember my Zoom settings. I'm going to go to Azure Active Directory. I'm going to zoom this in one more time. Now from here, I can go to app registrations. Now I'm going to create an application registration. An application registration is a way for me to tell Azure AD that I intend to connect to it and develop against it. Now, you actually might notice if you go, now this one is a little simpler, but you'll go into your own organization, you'll notice you might already have a lot of app registrations, because many times we install services or connect to companies, they actually have their own registrations they set up in your Azure AD tenant. So here, I go on a registered application. I'm going to call this Nova Code Camp. What type of accounts do I want to support? Well, I can support personal Microsoft accounts, all accounts. This is pretty much the equivalent to common. Accounts that are only in organizations, that's equivalent to organizations, or accounts only in my organization. So that will require me to put in a GUID. I'm very lazy. So I'm going to just say, you know what? If you belong to any organization, I'm good with this. Maybe I'm building a SaaS application that works B2B. Now at the bottom, we don't have to do this right now, but we're going to go ahead. We can establish redirect URIs. See, when we go to log in and register, it has to send us back somewhere, and we need to let Azure AD know in advance where we want to go back to. I'm going to build a native application. I'm going to do it manually in the browser in Visual Studio Code first, and now build it with .NET. So I'm going to build a public client native application, and for the redirect URI, I'm going to keep it super simple: HTTP localhost. No need to be fancy. I'm going to hit register, and I'm going to get my application registration. Now here I have a client ID. And this client ID, I'm going to just go ahead and copy it and go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to be able to use that. So we're going to go to login.microsoftonline.com. We're going to log in using an org account. We're going to go to that OAuth 2 endpoint. And since we're using the Microsoft Identity Platform, v2.0. Now, remember I said we're going to do the authorization code flow. So that means we're going to go have the user log in. The user is going to get a code back that basically says, hey, this user's logged in. This proves they're logged in. And then any backend service can go using that code and get tokens over and over again and refresh those tokens. So that's the flow we're going to work with. So the first step is to have the user log in. So we're going to go to authorize, and we're going to use a query strings to give it details. And then when we go to authorize, there's lots of details we're going to want to give it. If you're saying, hey, I'm going to need a list of all of these, that link I just sent you, again, it's an announcement, and the Q&A will actually have a table with all the possible query string values. Let's make sure we word wrap this. I'm a little nervous. Oh, sorry. Toggle word wrap. All right. First one is client ID. That's easy. We got that. Paste it. Bing. Done. The next one is response type. What type of response do we want? I want a code. Next one is redirect URI. Just as easy. HTTP localhost. All right. Next up. Response mode. This one is two possible values. You can either say form, post, or query. So you can actually have it send a GET request back to localhost with the code in the query string, or send a post request back to localhost with the code in a form post. Since we're just doing this manually, I'd rather see it in the query. You can also add another one that says state. You can put in any value there, and this allows you to check on the back end that you're really connected to the same session. I'm not going to bother with that today, but that's just a cool one to keep in the back of your pocket. Last one is scope. We haven't talked about this yet. Today, because of time, I'm only going to show you how to connect to Microsoft Graph, but I'm going to give you a link at the end for a YouTube channel where we're uploading tons of videos about this from both myself and the product team. And we are connecting all sorts of crazy stuff. Like I have a session where I take the same process we're doing now, and I connect to Azure SQL Database, Azure Cosmos DB. I connect to Azure Cognitive Services, and Azure Storage. So the process we follow today can be used to connect to any Azure service that supports Azure AD authentication, and that's crazy. So the way we do that is we go to API permissions, and we give our application registration permission to access an API. You notice by default, it already has one. It has permission to access the Microsoft Graph. That permission is graph.microsoft.com/user.read. Let's use that. So for our scope, it's going to be HTTPS graph.microsoft.com/user.read. It's not case sensitive. If I get this correct, I should be able to hit send request. It should give me some web content. Yeah, we got some HTML. So that means I did it right. So I'm going to go copy this URL. and go to my wonderful, wonderful browser that never likes to say zoomed in. And because I was already logged in as Elton Dixon, it says, hey, Elton Dixon, you're trying to connect to a new application. And this application is requesting permissions that you have not granted it already. This application is called Nova Code Camp. It's owned by C#Run.net. It's not published by Microsoft. So, warning, just like a mobile app, it's requesting permission to sign you in and read your profile, but it's also requesting permission to maintain access to this data. So not just a one-time thing, but to continue to have access to this data. I'm going to go ahead and give it permission. Now, since Elton is an administrator, Elton could consent on the behalf of the entire organization. We're not going to do that. So Elton has given this application permission. So it's going to redirect to HTTP localhost. This is very little, so I'm going to paste this into Visual Studio Code so we can pick this apart. So let's do some word wrap. We have a request rebound to localhost, returns a code, and a session state. Remember, this is different than the state I talked about earlier. If you included a state query string parameter, it will also include that. And if it echoes back as the same value, you know that you're part of the same set of requests. So that's my code right here. Just pasting it there for a little simplicity. So that's my code. We did the first half of all authorization code flow, which is we got authorization code. Now let's pretend we're the backend service and we want to actually go get a token to go connect to APIs. Well, we got the code from the user proven that they've authenticated and everything is good to go. So I should be able to issue a request to the backend to do something very similar. So instead of a GET request, when I'm the backend service, I'm going to issue a POST request. The beginning of this request is about the same, but instead of going to the authorized endpoint, I'm going to go to the token endpoint. Now, one of the cool things about this HTTP client is I can change my content type. So I'm going to change my content type. I'm going to paste this in because I'm so scared of typos, to application, and I like to do form data. You can do it with JSON. I prefer form data. I think it's a little bit easier for me to read when I'm playing around, prototyping, troubleshooting. So for form data, we can actually just put all of these values on different lines. So let's talk through that. So for form data, we're going to still need the scope. We're going to need the redirect URI, and we're going to need the client ID. So redirect URI, scope, and client ID. We're also going to need some additional data when we're going to the token endpoint. This is Sidney looking at his notes. All right. The first thing we're going to need is we're going to need a grant type. So grant underscore type. What type of grant we want to give it? Authorization code. The final thing we're going to need is our code. Luckily, we have that. Copy and paste. All right, fingers crossed that Sidney doesn't have any typos. Sidney totally has some typos somewhere that he hasn't seen yet. Send request. Wow, this is the very first time I've ever done this and not screw up the first one. I got a bearer token. This is an OAuth bearer token, so I can go to the graph. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Remember, I wanted to create a graph and get my profile. I sent request. I'm not authorized. Well, let's send this request. Uh-oh. I've already redeemed my token. Should have just opened them up in different browser windows. Y'all can pick on me later. All right, file, new file. Save as graph token.htp. Basically, I told you I was due for a demo bug. Basically, once you redeem that code, it's over. You need to use refresh token. The first time you get a token, and after that, you have to refresh that token. It says, hey, Sidney, you tried to use the same code twice to get 2 brand new tokens. You should have either refreshed the token or get a new code. So we're going to get a new code. So this is my auth. Let's do this one more time. Everybody hang with me on this. Just hope I didn't screw it up too bad. Log in to MicrosoftOnline.com, authorized. Dart. I was already logged in, so it sent me to localhost. Go paste this in. Here's my code. I just like to separate it, make it a little bit easier for me to see the code. All right. I'm going to go here, redeem my code for a token. There's my bearer token. And then now finally I can come back. I'm going to go to graph.microsoft.com v1.0 me. hit send request. Access token is empty. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is authorization. This is a bearer token. Paste my bearer token in. Save it. Send the same request again. Fingers crossed, everyone. I got my profile. So one demo bug. I'll take it. It could be way worse than that. All right. So that's how we manually do it. We got about 15 minutes left, and I want to at least leave 5 or 10 minutes at the end for us to any Q&A questions. I know I'm showing you a lot of stuff really fast. But for this last 15 minutes, what I like to do for you is show you how to do the same thing, but using the Microsoft Authentication Library. So before I do that, I put one link as an announcement in Q&A. Put one more link there. Let's just make that announcement. These two links are to the documentation pages for developing against the Microsoft Identity Platform. Are you using MSAL, or are you doing it manually like I just showed you? Or if you do it now or do it later, please, check out those links. That has a little query string at the end. That tells Microsoft Sidney sent you. That's our way to know if this documentation is good or useful. If it's not, that msusdev@microsoft.com email, let us know if it's not useful. Again, the product team's helping us out, so we'd love to update the documentation. They're very passionate about it, and we just actually got in a Twitter argument yesterday about the Graph team needing to provide more SDK code examples on docs.com for more programming languages. And they're like, totally, heard you. How do we do this as fast as possible? All right, rant over. Let's build a .NET application. So I'm going to clear my screen. Normally, you'll see people do .NET New Console. I am a cheater. I have built my own project template. So my favorite one is .NET New Script. It creates what we call a .NET top-level program. So .NET Build. Now I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. And there's my script.cs file. So this is a top-level program. So I'm using blocks and then jump immediately into the code. Really awesome for teaching people .NET, or if I just want to show you how to do something like use the MSAL library. We don't have to deal with a lot of mess here. So, .NET run, it'll print hello world. Now, I want to use the Microsoft Authentication Library. So I'm going to go to NuGet.org. Make sure I'm still zoomed in enough. I hate how it's not zooming in, or keeping my zoom. And from here, I'm going to go to Microsoft.identity.client. This is the MSAL library on NuGet. So Microsoft Identity Client. I'm just pasting lots of chats in the Q&A as we go. So to add that to my project, I just need to do .NET, zoom in just a little bit more, add package, Microsoft.identity.client. All right, perfect. So from here, I'll just delete everything using Microsoft.identity.client. And now I want to be able to print stuff really fast. So I'm going to use static system.console. That way I can just say write line. Okay, let's write our code. And it's actually not that bad. First, we need our client ID. So string client ID equals, I'm going to go back to the Azure portal, which I closed. Sidney, you closed the Azure portal, but don't you love Azure? Don't you always want to be in the Azure portal? I closed it. I don't know what to do. Copy my client ID, paste it. There we go. I am going to start using the MSAL library. So they have a really cool class called Public Client Application Builder. It allows you to create a public client application and then configure it using Fluent methods. Now, we really don't care about a whole bunch of deep configuration settings. The only thing I want to set here is the redirect URI. So with redirect URI, HTTP localhost. If you don't set, you can actually also add a with, I believe it's tenant, and or not with tenant, with authority. And this is where you can set like common or organizations or your organization's GUID. I'm not going to set it. If you don't set it by default, it's common, which allows both Microsoft accounts and organizational accounts. Once we're done with the Fluent methods, we just call build, and it's going to return a public client application. So I'll put that in a variable called app. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an array of scopes. So string array called scopes equals new string array. And the scope is HTTPS graph, Microsoft.com, use.read. fun thing, as you start getting to Azure services, you're going to see like, azure.database.net or cosmos.api. Really, scope names are just some weirdly wacky and fun stuff. Now that we have our public client application configured, we're going to go to app.acquire token. Now we could do that whole flow again, but this time I'm going to do interactive authentication. Interactive authentication basically means the application is going to open the browser window, the user is going to log in, and then we're going to get the token directly. So acquire token interactive. Now it has a fluent method called execute async. I'm going to await asynchronous methods. Yes, if you haven't played with top level programs, they're async by default. So I'm await the result of that. I forgot, whenever you call your method to acquire a token, you need to tell it a token for what scopes. I have a scopes array. And then I'm going to put the result in a variable called result. Finally, right line, result.access token. Easy peasy. All right. No demo bugs. .NET run. Now it's going to open the last browser you're in. So if you're used to playing around with different accounts, my recommendation is use Edge and guest mode. And then make sure you click that guest mode browser window. That way everything keeps popping up. It's in whatever browser window you clicked last. So we're going to log in as Elton Dixon. We already have permissions for user.read, so authentication is complete. Notice it redirected us to localhost. The MSTyle library picked up on that, grabbed our access token, and we are done. That was easy, like ridiculously easy compared to what I did earlier. I mean, how easy? I'm going to show you real fast how we can access the graph. So this is an amazing package called Flurl. Flurl.http, and there's a regular one for Flurl. It allows you to build URLs using strings and then issue requests directly against them. I know I've used HTTP client. I've used all the different Microsoft web request clients. It's not as good as this. Once you see it, you're going to go, wow, I need to use that tomorrow. Flurl.http, I'm going to add a using declaration for that. We don't need to print out the access token anymore, so we'll delete that. So HTTP graph.microsoft.com v1.0 me. I believe it's the endpoint we're going to. I'm just going to double check. Yep, v1.0/me. Here's how easy Flurl is. .get string async. Store the result in a string variable called JSON. That's it. I've issued my web request. That's ridiculous to me. Now this is going to fail because I'm not authorized to access this, just like when we did in the client in Visual Studio Code. But they have more fluent methods. Here's my favorite one. With OAuth bearer token. I have one, result.access token. Done. I have now implemented code to query the graph. I'm not kidding. That's all I needed. I'm going to write line JSON out, assuming I don't blow anything up. .NET run. Log in as Elton Dixon again. And there's Elton Dixon's JSON profile. That's fun. Now, this wouldn't be a great code camp talk if I didn't make it even easier. I'm telling you, I feel like a used car salesman. But this is exciting because I've had to implement ADAL. And I've actually implemented a couple thousand line application that some poor soul is maintaining to do all this stuff. And it's so much easier now. And before I go into the last demo, the product team for this is super open, super vocal on GitHub, and I'm not joking. The old way of doing this was like 50 or 60 lines of code, even with MSTyle. And I was asked by the product team to speak at the Insider Dev Tour in DC before it was canceled. When they asked me to speak at the Insider Dev Tour, they gave me a demo file. It was like 50, 60 lines of code. I'm like, I'm not going on stage and doing 50, 60 lines of code. They're like, well, that's how the API works. Can we make it better? Yeah, so I actually got on a call with one of them because they literally was like, all right, we hear you. I got on a call and I said, okay, where is it on GitHub? I looked at it on GitHub and I rewrote some of the the Graph SDK library to make it so much easier to work with. And they streamlined, they approved and reviewed it, and that didn't have anything to do with Azure MVP. They had no idea I was at Azure MVP until about a year later. That was just somebody from the community wanted to help, and they were willing to listen. They're on Twitter right now. People are complaining about, again, like I said, not enough developer samples. They're like, okay, how can we make this better? Do y'all want to contribute, or do y'all want to wait for us to do it? The graph team, especially on the dev side, is a very, very interesting team that's very interested in getting more people using the graph and putting out something that people would be excited to use. So they put out 2 libraries. That was my little rant about but I've just never felt that way about another Azure team. I've worked with quite a few in the past. It's not like this. So they have the Microsoft Graph Library. This allows you to query the graph using C# code. And I mean, you can install it using .NET add package Microsoft.graph. And I'll do that. .NET add package Microsoft.graph. Now, I would still have to get my access token, then I would have to pass it into the graph library. Well, the product team heard the complaints and they said, well, and this is the one I helped out with. They said, can we connect the MSAL to the Microsoft Graph Library? Yeah, it's going to take a little while to figure it out. So they created another library called Microsoft Graph.auth, which is technically in pre-release, but it's super stable. What this does is it creates a bridge that allows you to use MSAL types as a constructor parameter to Microsoft Graph SDK libraries. So if you already written a bunch of MSAL code for other parts of your application, you don't have to rewrite them to use the graph. So Microsoft Graph.auth, unfortunately, it's a pre-release, so you do have to specify the version. New gets weird like that. So .NET add package Microsoft.graph.auth. This is my official way of saying NuGet should have a command that say get latest preview. So I don't have to do this. We'll get preview 5. I'll clear my screen. Let me show you what this looks like. So we're going to delete all of this. You're really going to delete all of that? Yeah, we're going to delete all of that. So Microsoft.graph, that gives us the SDK. Using Microsoft.graph.auth, that gives us the connection. So Microsoft Graph.auth has a provider or library of providers for every authentication flow, much like MSAL has a library of classes for auth flows. We're going to get the interactive authentication provider. And I'm going to just create a variable named provider. I'm going to new it up. And since this is C#9 I'm using, I don't need to specify the type again. So when we set up our provider, we need to pass in a public client application and an array of scopes. That's it. The next thing we're going to create is a graph service client. This comes from the Microsoft.graph library. I'm going to call this client. And when we new this up, I know IntelliSense still tries to force you to specify a type. No, I'm going to be cool. I'm going to pass in my provider. That's it. I'm done with authentication for the Microsoft Graph Library. So I could just use it. So client, I want to get my profile. So .me, I'm going to build a request, .request, and I'm going to issue a GET asynchronously. I'm going to await the result. And if I look at this, it's going to return a user. So create a variable called user, name it me, and store it there. I want to write out my display name. So me.displayName. I like the Graph SDK because it gives me strong types. And it's actually automatically generated as the Graph API is updated. So this should just print out the name. Let's try it out. .NET run. Sign as Elton Dixon. And it got the name from the Graph SDK. So I showed you a lot today. But to recap, basically, we looked at the MSAL library, but before that, we looked at the Microsoft Identity Platform, how to authenticate manually, and then how to authenticate using the library. Couple things that definitely want you to check out. We have a GitHub repo where we put this presentation. I just put that link in the chat. I'm going to just drag that window in here and zoom in because Edge isn't nice to me. So I'm really proud of this. I convinced the team to let us do this. We put all of our presentations on GitHub and they're in Markdown so that the and it's not finished. You actually see some of them are unfinished. We generate the PowerPoint files using GitHub Action build process. Yes, I know. Look, it's the little things in life, right? If you go click a presentation, you can actually just scan. It's a Markdown file, so you can just scan through the whole presentation. You're gonna notice how those images look very familiar. You can notice those links look very familiar. Hey, that's the exact demo you just showed me. It's gonna be like this all the way through. So if you're thinking of something you saw me do, you want to go look at the notes, you want to run through the demo yourself, I highly recommend you go check out the repo. We are super excited about this. One more link, and then I'm gonna open it up for a Q&A. Microsoft Dev Radio. Super passion project I work on with Matt Calder and a couple of his colleagues from the Dev Radio side and the cloud solution architects for Microsoft. Every couple of weeks I interview some of the CSAs. They're doing wacky stuff. Here's some of the interviews are down here. Like the team who's building hackathons on GitHub called What the Hack. Richard Timmering and his team, Bruce Costin, who are using Windows Virtual Desktop for advanced developer scenarios. I think, like, for instance, like 3D modeling for animation companies and like actual full-blown dev environments in Windows Virtual Desktop. I think this one with Scott Bounds actually talks at length about how actual TV studios are using Azure to create GPU forward workloads. One on a cloud adoption framework. So if you're architecting your organization, we have a good talk. I know my pictures on there. I literally introduce them and I turn my mic off. These are people who literally fly around the world and answer customer questions every day, and so I'm just absolutely fascinated by the type of stuff they show off. The last thing I want to share with you is on this video list, we are actually in real time uploading our videos on the MSAL library. We just finished uploading all of our videos about the JavaScript side of things. So how to use the Microsoft Identity or Microsoft Graph Toolkit, how to use the Graph SDK for JavaScript. The exact same presentation I just showed you, but the JavaScript version, all that's already on YouTube. And the next week, we're going to be uploading all the .NET versions. What I showed you was just video 1. We have a video 2 where we actually talk in depth about how to use the MSAL library to connect to Azure SQL Database, Azure Storage, Azure Cosmos DB, Azure Cognitive Services. And then I think we have a third video where we go really deep into Graph SDK, not just how to say, get your profile, but like how to send an email, how to create a Teams group, how to query all the Teams meetings you had over the week, all sorts of stuff. Again, the graph is just an API for all the information in Microsoft 365, not just static data, but it also allows you to access some of the AI insights they use. So we see recommendations and Outlook, stuff like that. All of that's in the graph. So with all that being said, I know, Labrina, you're hanging out in the background. Thank y'all so much for your time. I'm going to again be hanging out for like 5 or 10 minutes, just trying to answer any questions I can in the chat. And if I can't answer them, I'll point you in the right direction.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Sidney, so much. That was super, super helpful. I know for me, it's super crazy with the MSAL libraries, previously with trying to use applications to authenticate with Azure AD. Usually, before, we were always pushing that to the end as a developer. We'll get around to the authentication piece later because it was so complicated. And so now with MSAL, that's sprint to, we're let's get the authentication in because it's super easy. So yeah, thanks so much for that. I don't think that we have too many questions. You kind of answered a lot of them. I do want to say, for sure, I like all the other things that you're showing as well with MSUS. So, because one of the things my team had worked on was building some React components with for authentication. So I think it's due for an update. So I definitely want to maybe pick your brain about that going forward. So
we have 2 videos on the YouTube channel about the Microsoft Graph Toolkit, which is all React, native React components.
Oh, nice.
I know this is gonna sound weird, but as a developer, you always I want to build stuff myself. But the product team actually recommends, whenever possible, just use the Graph Toolkit component because you push the SLA off to somebody else. They have all sorts of redundancy features and stuff in there that you probably your team hasn't thought of yet. And a lot of people chuckle when I say that, but that's the same reason we use stuff like Entity Framework or the Azure SDKs. Yeah. They have retry, throttling, caching built in. You'd be shocked how many times I say, Entity Framework, when it comes to Azure SQL Database, automatically retries if there's a failed connection. What? When did it start doing that? A few years ago. That's same concept of the Graph Toolkit. They implemented all sorts of token caching, token refreshing, all the nasty stuff that you might not want to implement.
That's a good point, because that is something we were stumbling on, was with token caching. with some of the apps that we were building on our side. And yeah, so I might have to check that out. So I will definitely check that out now. So that you just see how networking just like saves saves everybody time. So okay, well, cool. Well, thank you, Sydney, so much for your time. Thanks for the awesome presentation.